All right, today we're jumping into a really intense and pivotal chapter in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 12. And this isn't just a random collection of stories. It's more like a series of 5 showdowns, these intense confrontations between Jesus and the religious leaders. And with each clash, you can just feel the tension ratchet up, revealing this massive conflict between just following the rules versus actually having a real relationship.
So here's how it's all going to go down. We'll start with this big debate over the Sabbath, which then spirals into some pretty heavy accusations involving demonic power and a warning about an unforgivable sin. From there, we'll see a demand for proof, a really chilling story about an empty house, and it all wraps up with Jesus completely redefining what family even means. Okay, let's get into it.
So our first major showdown is all about one of the most sacred laws in Judaism, the Sabbath. And right away, you can see the battle lines being drawn. It's rigid, man-made tradition on one side, and this radical idea of mercy on the other.
So let's back up for a second. What is the Sabbath? Well, the idea comes straight out of the creation story. After God created everything in 6 days, he rested on the 7th. Now, it's not like God needed a nap, of course. He was setting a pattern, a rhythm of work and rest that was meant to be a gift for all of us.
But over the centuries, this amazing gift of rest had become a really heavy burden. Religious leaders built what they called a fence around the law, basically hundreds of extra rules designed to keep people from even getting close to breaking the original command. And get this, some of these rules were, well, they were pretty wild. Spitting on dirt could be called plowing. And if a deer ran into your house and you shut the door, that could be considered hunting. It's this intense, nitpicky legalism that Jesus is about to walk right into. So here's where it all kicks off. It starts with something so simple. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field, and his guys are hungry. So they just start picking some heads of grain to eat. Seems harmless, right? Well, not to the Pharisees. To them, this wasn't just grabbing a snack. Oh no. In their book, this was work. Plucking was harvesting, and rubbing the grain was threshing. And they immediately call them out for breaking the Sabbath.
And this one little moment just reveals 2 completely different ways of seeing the world. For the Pharisees, God's law was this rigid rule book where following every single letter was all that mattered. But for Jesus, the law was a gift designed for people's good. The spirit of the law, things like mercy and compassion, that's what was most important.
And Jesus just cuts right through all the noise. He quotes the Old Testament prophet Hosea, reminding them that God has always cared more about a person's heart, about mercy, than about them perfectly performing every single ritual. He's basically saying, guys, you've completely missed the point. God cares about people way more than he cares about your rules.
Then Jesus just calmly lays out his case, 1, 2, 3. First, he brings up history. He reminds them that even their great King David broke a religious rule when he and his men were starving, and God was okay with it. Second, he uses their own law against them, pointing out that priests work all the time in the temple on the Sabbath, and nobody calls that a sin. And finally, he just hits them with plain old common sense, asking, which of you, if your sheep fell in a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't get it out? I mean, a person is so much more valuable than a sheep, right? And then he drops the bombshell. Jesus doesn't just say he's right about the law. He claims to be in charge of the law. By calling himself Lord of the Sabbath, he's making an absolutely massive claim. He's saying he's God, the one who created the Sabbath to begin with. You can just imagine the shock in the air after he said that.
Now, having completely lost the legal debate, you'd think the Pharisees might back down. But no. Instead, their attacks get way more personal and way more dangerous. The fight shifts from what Jesus is doing to the source of his power.
So the confrontation just explodes. Jesus performs this incredible, undeniable miracle. He heals a man who couldn't see, couldn't speak, and was demon-possessed. The crowd is totally amazed, wondering, could this be the Messiah? But the Pharisees, they can't deny the miracle happened, so they attack its source. Their accusation is just wild. They claim he's not using God's power, but Satan's. And Jesus immediately points out how illogical that is. He says, think about it. A kingdom divided against itself will fall. Why would Satan fight his own demons? It just makes no sense.
And this leads Jesus to give this really serious, chilling warning about what many call the unpardonable sin. Now, it's important to understand what this is. It's not about accidentally saying a bad word or having a moment of doubt. It's about looking at a clear, powerful, undeniably good work of God's Spirit, like healing this man, and then consciously and deliberately saying, that's the work of the devil. It's calling the ultimate good the ultimate evil.
And Jesus makes this really fascinating distinction here.
He says you can speak against him as the Son of Man in his human form and be forgiven. You might misunderstand him, you might reject him out of ignorance, but to speak against the Holy Spirit, to see the raw divine power of God clearly at work and willfully call it evil, he says that's a final line to cross.
The tension just keeps building. After witnessing so many incredible miracles, the religious leaders are somehow still not satisfied. So now they demand that Jesus prove himself, which sets up this clash between their constant demand for proof and his focus on prophecy.
I mean, can you believe the audacity after literally seeing a blind and mute man healed right in front of them, not to mention countless other miracles? They come up to Jesus and say, "Teacher, show us a sign." This wasn't a genuine search for truth. It was a test. It was another trap to try and discredit him.
And Jesus' response is incredibly sharp. He doesn't hold back. He calls them a wicked and adulterous generation because they've been unfaithful to God. And he tells them he's not going to perform like a magician for them. He says they'll get one more sign, and only one, the sign of the prophet Jonah.
So what on earth is the sign of Jonah? Well, think back to that Old Testament story. The prophet Jonah was in the belly of a giant fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he came out alive. Jesus is saying, just like Jonah was in the deep for 3 days, I, the Son of Man, will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. It's a direct prophecy of his own death, his burial, and his resurrection. That, he says, is going to be the final, ultimate sign for them. Okay, so right after this, Jesus pivots and tells this short but really powerful story, a parable, and it serves as this dire warning to that generation about the huge difference between just cleaning up your life on the outside and being truly transformed on the inside. The story goes like this. Imagine an evil spirit is cast out of someone. That person's life, their house, gets all cleaned up. Everything is swept, put in order, looks great from the outside. But, and this is the absolute key, the house is left empty. Well, eventually, that spirit comes back, sees the place is all clean but unoccupied, and it goes and gets 7 other spirits even worse than itself, and they all move in. And the person ends up in a far worse state than they were in the beginning.
Now, this wasn't just some random story. Jesus is applying this directly to the Pharisees and their generation. See, they had reformed outwardly. As a nation, they weren't worshiping idols like their ancestors did. Their house was swept clean of that sin, but their hearts were still empty because they refused to let the rightful owner, Jesus himself, move in. And Jesus is warning that this spiritual vacuum makes them vulnerable to something even worse.
And the chapter wraps up with this really personal, almost intimate moment. Jesus gets interrupted by his biological family, and he uses it as this incredible teaching moment to redefine the whole concept of family itself.
So picture it. Jesus is in the middle of teaching a crowd. The place is packed, and someone interrupts to say, "Hey, your mother and your brothers are outside and they want to talk to you." Now, in that culture, family obligations were huge. Everyone would have expected him to stop everything right then and there. But Jesus does something completely unexpected. He gestures to the people sitting around him, his disciples, and he says that his true family isn't about blood relations. He says his real family, his brother, sister, mother, are the people who do the will of his Father in heaven. This wasn't him dissing his earthly family. It was this radical, open invitation to everyone to become part of a new, spiritual family. And that really brings us to the core question of this entire chapter, doesn't it? From the debate about the Sabbath all the way to this new definition of family, Matthew 12 is pushing us to ask ourselves, what does it really mean to move beyond just a checklist of religious rules and actually enter into a genuine, living relationship with God? It was the heart of the conflict back then, and it's absolutely still the big question for us today.